November 20, 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, 8:45 hours. Special Duty Officer Enen Koshiot held binoculars tightly, the slight tremor in his hands betraying the tension of the moment. Through the humid morning haze, he observed a phenomenon that defied all previous expectations. Emerging from the shallow waters of the lagoon, unfamiliar armored vehicles advanced across the coral reef, a natural defensive barrier the Japanese had relied upon for over a year and a half. A fellow soldier whispered in awe, "The harbinger of death has arrived," though the sound barely rose above the low hum of distant diesel engines. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had placed absolute faith in the protective value of coral reefs. These reefs were expected to prevent American landing craft from reaching the shore, forcing any attacking force to wade through deep water under concentrated fire. Yet, on that morning, this long-standing assumption was proving catastrophically inaccurate as the invading machines moved unimpeded. Reflecting later, Enen Koshiot would describe the meticulous Japanese defensive preparations. They had anticipated an American landing coinciding with high tide and positioned their forces accordingly. The surrounding reef extended between 500 and 800 yards from the beach, a carefully prepared zone of destruction. Mines, obstacles, and pre-registered gun emplacements created what was expected to be a nearly insurmountable defense. Planners assumed that an assault under these conditions would result in heavy American losses while Japanese forces remained relatively secure. At 8:51, the first tracked landing vehicle known by the Americans as an LVT, or alligator, crawled over the coral and onto the beach. That morning, 125 of these amphibious vehicles carried the initial 3 waves of the U.S. 2nd Marine Division toward Betio. From the perspective of the Japanese defenders, the battlefield had shifted in an instant. The invasion tactics that had once seemed predictable and manageable were suddenly obsolete. The fall of Guadalcanal in February 1943 had already signaled a strategic transformation in the Pacific, prompting Japanese planners to adapt. Recognizing that sustained defensive operations across the vast ocean were no longer feasible, Japanese military strategy shifted toward the concept of Zatai Kakuben, or the absolute national defense sphere. Under this doctrine, islands were to function as immovable aircraft carriers. Beaches became concentrated zones for inflicting maximum casualties, while natural coral reefs were intended to immobilize enemy vehicles and prevent successful landings. In September 1943, Rear Admiral Kiichiro Shibazaki arrived on Betio to assume command of the Japanese garrison. His forces included 1,122 naval infantry of the 3rd Special Base Force, 1,497 sailors from the 7th Special Naval Landing Force, and roughly 2,400 laborers, mostly a veteran of amphibious campaigns in China during the late 1932s, Shibazaki possessed a clear understanding of both the vulnerabilities and potential strengths of defending against beach assaults. By the time he stood on the northern shore of Betio, the island had been transformed into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Central Pacific. Despite its modest dimensions, only 800 yards at its widest and 2.5 miles in length, the island's defenses were formidable. Every meter of beach and reef had been prepared with the expectation that an invading force would arrive at high tide, yet the advent of amphibious armored vehicles was about to challenge even the most thorough Japanese plans. The island was fortified with an extensive array of defenses. Roughly 500 pillboxes dotted the landscape. 14 coastal artillery pieces were strategically positioned, including 4 colossal 8-inch Vickers guns, and numerous strongpoints were constructed using a combination of concrete, steel, coconut logs, and coral stone. Yet it was the surrounding reef that gave Commander Shibazaki his greatest assurance. Addressing his garrison, he confidently declared that even an army of 1 million men would require a century to wrest control of the island. This statement, however, was not mere bravado. It reflected careful calculations derived from established principles of amphibious warfare. The Japanese military had meticulously studied every significant landing operation of the modern age. They examined the British debacle at Gallipoli, the German inability to traverse the English Channel, and even Japan's own struggles in river crossings in China. Each instance reinforced the lesson that well-defended water obstacles presented nearly insurmountable barriers. American Higgins boats, for instance, required at least 4 feet of water to operate. Even at peak tide, they could not reach the shore closer than 300 yards from the reef. On paper, the numbers were daunting. Troops advancing through water typically moved no faster than 2 miles per hour. Traversing the 300-yard gap under concentrated fire from machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery would require a minimum of 5 minutes of perilous exposure. What the Japanese did not anticipate was that the United States Marine Corps had quietly been transforming the nature of amphibious warfare since 1940. The innovation had its origins not in a military facility, but in the Florida Everglades, where a wealthy inventor, Donald Roebling, had created a rescue vehicle capable of navigating swamps and flood zones inaccessible to conventional vehicles and boats. This tracked amphibious craft, known as the Alligator, was initially intended for civilian rescue missions in 1935. By 1941, the Marines had recognized its potential for military operations and had begun converting it into a fully operational amphibious landing vehicle. Japanese intelligence, however, had completely overlooked these developments. Their understanding of American landing capabilities remained frozen in the 1942 mindset, based on observations at Wake Island and German reports about the DEP raid. The very notion of a tracked vehicle capable of moving through water and over reefs simply did not exist in Japanese strategic planning, leaving a critical blind spot. Meanwhile, Japanese forces had spent months refining the island's defenses. Channels were mined, obstacles were installed, and artillery was carefully registered on predetermined coordinates where landing craft were expected to become stuck. Every detail had been rehearsed to perfection. In contrast, the Americans were producing vehicles that rendered all these preparations largely irrelevant. As 8:40, the Japanese observed the approaching American craft assembling in assault formations just beyond the reef, exactly as their calculations had predicted. Troops expected to wade ashore under fire once the boats grounded on the reef. Gunners checked their weapons. Mortar teams made final adjustments. Every defender was poised for the moment they had drilled for countless times. Then the unexpected occurred. The first wave of American landing craft did not stop at the reef. Instead, they climbed directly onto it. Private Don Crane, commanding an LVT-4 in the initial wave, maneuvered against wind and current through the lagoon's passage toward what would become the most lethal sector of the beach on Tarawa. Within the armored, amphibious tractor, Crane had no awareness that he was about to render 3 years of Japanese defensive strategy obsolete. The LVT crawled forward over the coral at roughly 4 miles per hour, slow and awkward, but unstoppable. Japanese gunners opened fire, yet their weapons were designed to create interlocking fields of fire across the water, not to target vehicles operating directly atop the reef itself. The combination of advanced engineering and tactical innovation had effectively neutralized the defenses that the Japanese had relied upon so heavily, signaling a dramatic shift in the nature of amphibious assault and setting the stage for a pivotal battle in the Pacific theater. By 900 hours, the scale of the calamity confronting Japanese commanders at Tarawa was becoming unmistakably clear. The meticulous calculations that had guided the defense of the atoll, including the identification of lethal zones along the reefs, were rendered irrelevant within minutes. The initial waves of LVTs, amphibious vehicles unfamiliar to the Japanese forces, bypassed these planned killing zones entirely, delivering USS Marines directly onto the sand without the predicted attrition. Inside his command bunker, Admiral Shibazaki received fragmented updates that defied all expectations. Reports indicated that the Americans were not struggling through the shallows as anticipated. Instead, they were driving straight onto the beaches, effectively neutralizing the reef, which had been central to Japan's defensive strategy. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Shibazaki ordered his troops to destroy the vehicles at the shoreline, but the disruption of communications from ongoing naval bombardments severely limited his command. Furthermore, Japanese positions were oriented to target infantry wading in water, leaving them ill-prepared for enemies already established on land. Months of training and extensive planning were suddenly obsolete, undone by a weapon the defenders had never encountered. Kiyoshi So, a survivor from the transport division of the SIBO 7th Special Naval Landing Force, later recounted that in the pillbox near the base of the main wharf, nearly half of the personnel were killed during the first hour of the attack. The psychological impact on the Japanese forces was profound, compounding the tactical shock of the LVT's appearance. Japanese military doctrine relied heavily on exhaustive preparation and the anticipation of foreseeable scenarios. No strategy had been developed for an adversary capable of circumventing the natural defenses that were assumed to be insurmountable. As the morning progressed, Japanese defenders struggled to respond to the unprecedented assault. Naval artillery, designed to engage ships offshore, attempted to target the small, maneuverable LVTs as they crossed the reef, often with limited effect. Anti-tank guns positioned to protect the beaches found their fields of fire obstructed by seawalls they were meant to defend. Of the 125 LVTs deployed in the initial assault, only 35 remained operational by day's end. While Japanese forces inflicted some damage, it was insufficient to halt the invasion. Meanwhile, subsequent waves of conventional landing craft could advance closer to the shore, shielded by suppressive fire from the LVTs already on the beaches. The coordinated defensive scheme, once meticulously designed, had disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance, each unit fending for itself. By approximately 1300 hours, Admiral Shibazaki's command post was obliterated by naval gunfire, killing him and his entire staff. Isolated Japanese units were left to confront a foe employing tactics entirely foreign to them, fighting in a chaotic environment with no central coordination. The introduction of LVTs at Tarawa illustrated a fundamental clash in military philosophy. Japanese defenses were constructed under the assumption that natural obstacles, when combined with disciplined personnel, could compensate for material shortcomings. The LVTs invalidated this assumption, exposing the limitations of Japan's resource-constrained, technologically restricted approach to warfare. These amphibious vehicles, built in repurposed food processing factories and powered by aircraft engines, reflected an industrial capability that Japan could not rival. The larger LVT-2 Water Buffalo, deployed during the battle, weighed 32,500 pounds, carried a crew of 6, and transported either 24 fully equipped troops or 5,000 pounds of supplies. The production of even a single LVT required significant quantities of steel, aluminum, rubber, and precision engineering resources that Japan's overstretched wartime economy could no longer sustain. In essence, the LVTs not only provided a tactical advantage on the battlefield, but also symbolized the broader industrial and technological disparity between the United States and Japan, marking a turning point in the understanding of amphibious warfare in the Pacific theater. News of the fall of Tarawa reached Japanese forces scattered across the Pacific Islands within a matter of weeks, yet the full significance of the new amphibious vehicles, the LVTs, was slow to be appreciated. The entrenched doctrines within the Japanese military, especially under a rigid hierarchical command, did not allow for rapid adaptation. Many leaders viewed the Tarawa experience as an anomaly, believing that improved preparation, heightened morale, or sheer determination could offset the growing technological edge of the Americans. On Saipan, in December 1943, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito received comprehensive intelligence regarding the LVTs. In response, he instructed the deployment of additional mines along the reef approaches and positioned extra anti-tank weaponry near the shoreline. Despite these measures, Saito remained convinced that the natural reef defenses would buy sufficient time for Japanese counterattacks to inflict significant damage on any landing force. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy's technical branch explored ways to counter the amphibious vehicles. Concepts such as underwater nets designed to entangle the LVT's tracks and specialized mines capable of piercing coral were considered. However, these ideas never advanced beyond the conceptual stage. Japan simply lacked the industrial capacity to produce entirely new weapon systems while sustaining ongoing war production. By June 15, 1944, at 542 hours, American forces landed on Saipan with a far larger and more sophisticated amphibious armada than had attacked Tarawa. The invasion included 719 landing vehicles, notably the LVT-4, which featured a rear ramp allowing troops to disembark without exposing themselves to defensive fire, and the LVTA-4, a variant equipped with a. Unlike the improvised vehicles that had appeared at Tarawa, these machines were purpose-built for war. Some were fitted with tank turrets, others carried artillery pieces, and all operated in coordinated units with radio communication enabling tactical maneuvers beyond the Japanese defenders' ability to counter. As the assault unfolded, Japanese troops witnessed LVTA-4 seconds firing directly into fortified positions. Structures that had withstood small arms and mortar fire, coconut logs, and coral fortifications were shattered by the sustained firepower of these amphibious armored vehicles. What had been considered natural, impenetrable barriers in the form of coral reefs were effectively transformed into avenues for American armored units to advance unimpeded. By the time American forces approached Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese commanders had begun to revise their tactics, not in the hope of defeating the LVTs, but in recognition of their unstoppable nature. Colonel Kuno Nakagawa, in charge of the Peleliu garrison, meticulously reviewed reports from the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. His assessment was sobering. The beaches could not be held against the approaching force. Consequently, Nakagawa stationed only a single battalion along the shoreline to slow the American advance, while withdrawing the bulk of his troops to the Umabrogol Ridges terrain beyond the reach of LVTs. This strategic shift would render the battle for Peleliu one of the most devastating in the Pacific theater. It represented a tacit acknowledgement of defeat. Coral reefs that had once been considered formidable natural defenses were now merely temporary obstacles, incapable of stopping a modern amphibious assault. At the Battle of Peleliu, a total of 241 LVTs, landing vehicle tracks from the Honest 6th and 8th Amphibious Tractor Battalions, took part in the initial assault. Of these, 26 were confirmed destroyed, a loss rate that would have been devastating for traditional landing craft, but for LVTs, which had already fulfilled their primary role of delivering troops to the shoreline, the attrition was considered manageable. The real shock for Japanese commanders lay not in the vehicles themselves, but in the industrial and technological power they represented. By late 1944 US, production lines were capable of turning out roughly 500 LVTs each month. These vehicles were complex machines incorporating thousands of individual parts sourced from factories across the country. Each LVT required more steel than what Japan allocated for equipping an entire infantry company for a year. Japan had entered the conflict with a belief in Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, as a force capable of overcoming material shortages. The overwhelming numbers and effectiveness of LVTs shattered that assumption, demonstrating that no measure of willpower could counteract the sheer technological and manufacturing advantages of the United States. On February 19, 1945, at precisely 859 hours on the beaches of Iwo Jima, over 500 LVTs were deployed in the first waves of the assault. The volcanic ash that covered the island's coastline would have immobilized conventional landing craft, but the tracked vehicles advanced steadily, their treads gripping surfaces that would have caused wheeled transports to become stuck. The Japanese defenders, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had learned from earlier island battles. They deliberately avoided heavy resistance at the shore, instead retreating to pre-prepared defensive positions inland. This approach was a tacit recognition that American amphibious capabilities had reached a level that Japan could not counter directly at the water's edge. By the time U.S. forces approached Okinawa on April 1, 1945 at 830 hours, the pattern had become even clearer. Japanese commanders, including Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had studied every prior amphibious landing and concluded that American forces could choose the point and timing of landings at will. Consequently, beach defenses were largely abandoned in favor of fortified positions further inland. The invasion fleet arriving off Okinawa included more than 1,300 LVTs of various models, amphibious tractors, tanks, and trucks arriving in successive waves that seemed inexhaustible. These machines were capable of traversing virtually any coastal obstacle nature could present. The significance of LVTs extended beyond their immediate battlefield utility. They served as a stark demonstration of industrial strength and technological innovation, delivering a psychological blow from which Japanese military confidence never fully recovered. The proliferation of such vehicles on multiple islands illustrated that the U.S. had not only solved the tactical problem of landing troops on hostile shores, but had also established a strategic advantage rooted in production capacity and mechanized mobility. The coral formations encircling the Pacific Islands were long seen by Japan as a form of divine safeguard, a natural barrier that affirmed the empire's favor in the eyes of the gods. Yet, when mechanized vehicles began traversing these reefs, it wasn't merely a line of defense that was breached. An entire strategic worldview unraveled. The arrival of American LVTs on one island after another created a profound sense of inevitability among Japanese forces. Young recruits arrived at their positions already demoralized, having absorbed the terrifying accounts of these amphibious machines that seemed impossible to stop. Commanders struggled to maintain the confidence of their men, who were painfully aware that, despite months of preparation and fortification, the beaches would likely fall. Even when Japanese units captured or examined wrecked LVTs, the logic behind their construction was alien. These vehicles were assembled from standardized components, mass-produced with industrial precision. Their armor, though light, was adequate, and every part bore evidence of assembly on a scale Japan could not match. At the outset of the war, Japan possessed roughly 2,700 tanks. By contrast, the United States would manufacture over 18,000 LVTs alone by the conflict's conclusion, machines that had not even been considered in pre-1940 military planning. This stark numerical disparity encapsulated the industrial imbalance that would define Japan's Pacific struggle. The inability to foresee or counter the LVT threats reflected a deeper flaw in Japanese strategic assumptions. The imperial military had based its Pacific defenses on the belief that island combat would follow predictable patterns, ones favoring the defender, especially when protected by natural coral barriers. Admiral Soyoda, commander of the combined fleet, later acknowledged the miscalculation. "We planned for the war we anticipated, not the one that actually unfolded." When the Americans ignored our expectations and simply overcame obstacles we considered insurmountable, our entire strategy crumbled. At the heart of this failure lay a fundamental misunderstanding of American military culture. Where Japanese strategists interpreted obstacles as trials to be endured, Americans approached them as engineering problems to be solved. Coral reefs, envisioned as the natural shields of the Pacific, instead became the proving grounds for innovations like amphibious vehicles adapted from hurricane rescue equipment, machines that could decisively turn the tide of battle. Beyond strategic errors and technological surprises, human experience was at stake. Japanese soldiers witnessed months of meticulous preparation rendered irrelevant within hours. Many were young conscripts, barely out of adolescence, trained to believe that the beaches were impregnable, that the reefs would safeguard them, that their sacrifices carried lasting meaning. Confronted with the relentless advance of hundreds of amphibious vehicles, these men faced not only the prospect of death, but also a profound psychological shock. The Bushido Code, which promised spiritual resilience against material weakness, offered little solace as mechanized forces obliterated defensive works painstakingly built over weeks and months. In the end, the conflict on these islands illustrated the collision of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and human psychology. Nature, once thought to be an ally, was rendered irrelevant by human ingenuity. The Japanese assumption that geography could substitute for technological parity was decisively proven false, and the war in the Pacific was irrevocably shaped by the capacity to mobilize machines, adapt quickly, and challenge expectations. The Landing Vehicle Tract, or LVT, marked a turning point in the history of warfare, introducing a concept that had no precedent. For centuries, military leaders had relied on the natural features of terrain, rivers, reefs, cliffs, and other obstacles to amplify their defensive strength. The LVT challenged this fundamental assumption. Confronted with coral reefs that should have made any amphibious landing prohibitively difficult, American engineers simply devised vehicles capable of crossing them. This technological leap transformed the way combat operations could be planned and executed. Vice Admiral E. L. Cochran, who led the U.S., said, Navy Bureau of Ships during World War II emphasized the magnitude of this innovation, observing that the decisive victories at locations such as Tarawa, Quadline, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Palau, and Eniwetok owed their success directly to the deployment of these amphibious vehicles. The impact went beyond individual battles. It represented a fundamental redefinition of military possibilities. Japanese defensive strategies had been constructed under the assumption that certain geographic features offered invulnerable advantages. The emergence of the LVT demonstrated that with sufficient industrial capacity, no natural barrier was insurmountable, only engineering obstacles to be solved. By the early months of 1945, even prior to the atomic bombings, many Japanese officers recognized that the war was effectively lost. Their awareness did not come merely from the succession of lost battles, but from the manner in which those defeats unfolded. American forces were not simply breaking through Japanese defenses, they were rendering them irrelevant. This realization created a schism within the Japanese command. Some officers resorted to increasingly desperate tactics, such as kamikaze missions, while others, particularly younger staff officers who had witnessed American material superiority firsthand, began to quietly prepare for eventual surrender. When Japan capitulated in August 1945, occupying American forces discovered meticulous Japanese analyses of LVT tactics and engineering. Despite having no practical means to counter the vehicles during the war, Japanese engineers had carefully recorded every detail they could observe. A report drafted by the Navy Technical Department in July 1945 stated, "The American amphibious tractor has introduced a revolutionary change in warfare on par with the advent of gunpowder. It has rendered conventional defensive positions largely ineffective and provides attackers with an advantage that cannot be countered by traditional methods." These wartime observations had lasting post-war effects. Engineers who had attempted to counter American amphibious technology played a key role in Japan's emerging automotive and industrial sectors, applying lessons from US's mass production techniques. For those Japanese veterans who had endured the island campaigns, the memory of facing the LVT was especially painful. The bitterness stemmed not only from defeat, but from witnessing an entirely new form of military power that bypassed what they had considered impregnable defenses. The collapse of entrenched strategic assumptions, combined with the realization that industrial innovation had been a decisive factor, left a lasting psychological imprint. Many struggled to reconcile their wartime experiences with Japan's post-war embrace of industrial capitalism, the very system that had delivered their defeat. The LVT's effectiveness in the Pacific theater left a permanent mark on global military thinking. Its success inspired subsequent development in amphibious warfare, influencing naval strategy and vehicle design worldwide. The lessons learned from the LVT's deployment underscored a profound truth. In modern warfare, technological ingenuity and industrial capability can redefine the battlefield, nullifying what were once thought to be inviolable defensive positions. In the aftermath of observing amphibious campaigns in the Pacific, the Soviet Union initiated the development of its own line of amphibious military vehicles. Meanwhile, the British military, which had faced significant difficulties executing amphibious landings during the European theater, looked to American advancements in landing vehicle technology for potential deployment in Southeast Asia. During the Korean War, production of new amphibious vehicles relied heavily on Japanese industrial capabilities under contracts with the United States. Ironically, engineers who had once tried to resist the introduction of LVTs were now contributing to their construction. The story came full circle decades later. In the 1962, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, known for having constructed many of the Japanese fortifications across the Pacific Islands, began designing amphibious vehicles intended for civilian disaster response. These vehicles, meant to aid communities affected by tsunamis and floods, drew directly on design principles developed for military LVTs, as well as the lessons learned from Japan's experience in defending against them. In this way, the technology that had once wrought massive destruction across the Pacific ultimately returned to a humanitarian purpose, built by the very nation it had once failed to stop. The inability of the Japanese military to foresee or counter the LVT threat provides a lasting lesson in the risks of rigid strategic assumptions. Japan's entire Pacific defense doctrine was built on the premise that natural barriers such as coral reefs were insurmountable obstacles. The introduction of relatively simple American engineering solutions shattered this assumption, demonstrating how even complex defensive plans can be undermined by innovative technologies. Modern military analysts continue to study the LVT as an early example of disruptive technology in warfare. Just as Japanese planners could not conceptualize amphibious tracked vehicles, contemporary defense forces are warned against assuming that current advantages are permanent or invulnerable. The disparity between American LVT production and Japanese counter-efforts underscores the broader industrial imbalance that shaped the Pacific War. From 1941 to 1945, the United States produced more than 18,000 LVTs, with peak output reaching approximately 500 vehicles per month in early 1944. Production was spread across 8 major facilities, with primary manufacturing handled by companies such as Food Machinery Corporation and Borg-Warner. In contrast, Japanese efforts to develop specialized anti-LVT weapons never advanced beyond prototypes, and no effective countermeasures were ever deployed in combat. The impact of this technological and industrial gap is evident in the war's major amphibious battles. At Tarawa, only 35 LVTs remained operational after the first day of fighting. In the invasion of Saipan, a total of 71 9A amphibious vehicles were deployed, while at Peleliu, 241 LVTs were used to transport troops. During the landing at Iwo Jima, over 500 LVTs were involved in the initial waves, and at Okinawa, more than 1,300 vehicles participated. These figures illustrate the decisive role of American amphibious vehicles in overcoming natural and man-made obstacles, highlighting the consequences of Japan's failure to anticipate and adapt to this form of warfare. Japanese military planners in the Pacific consistently overestimated the natural defenses of the islands they occupied. They anticipated that any Allied landing would occur several hundred yards offshore, typically between 300 and 800 yards, and that their forces would face catastrophic casualties while attempting to traverse coral reefs under fire. Calculations predicted that crossing these reefs would take up to 10 minutes and that losses could range from 60 to 80%. In reality, the introduction of amphibious tractors, or LVTs, completely upended these assumptions. Landing vehicles could reach the beach directly, eliminating the expected exposure to heavy fire, cross coral obstacles in 3 to 5 minutes, and suffer minimal losses, often less than 10%. The Japanese approach to warfare had been deeply influenced by a long-standing military culture that prized spirit, honor, and the strategic advantages provided by terrain. Their entire defensive strategy relied on the expectation that geography itself would serve as a formidable barrier to invasion. Coral reefs were assumed to be impassable obstacles, natural fortifications that would prevent any assault from succeeding without prohibitive cost. This expectation was shattered on November 20, 1943, when American LVTs rolled onto the reef at Betio. The event demonstrated not merely a tactical breach, but the collapse of an entire strategic framework, one that had placed faith in the permanence of nature's defenses. Subsequent island assaults reinforced the same sobering lesson. The rapid technological and logistical adaptability of the United States showed that no defensive advantage was unassailable. Coral, cliffs, and other natural barriers could be overcome with engineering and industrial capability. Japanese soldiers defending positions on Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were casualties of both American firepower and their own command structure's inability to anticipate the new realities of mechanized warfare. Promises of inviolable natural fortifications proved illusory. American forces repeatedly demonstrated that LVTs could navigate deep channels and ascend coral ridges, making previously impregnable positions vulnerable. The vehicles themselves symbolized more than technological superiority. They embodied a fundamentally different approach to combat, treating every obstacle as a solvable problem rather than an insurmountable barrier. Today, the reefs of the Pacific lie undisturbed beneath calm tropical waters, yet they bear witness to one of the most decisive failures in military planning. The collapse of Japanese assumptions about natural defenses highlighted a crucial shift in modern warfare. In the era of industrialized armies, obstacles are temporary, not permanent. The LVTs that transformed beaches into points of vulnerability demonstrated the futility of relying on geography alone. The Americans made the seemingly impossible routine, revealing that the defeat of Japan was not just a possibility but an inevitability. Ultimately, the Japanese misjudgment regarding amphibious vehicles explains more about the outcome of the Pacific War than any single engagement. Their belief in coral reefs as impenetrable shields proved disastrous. American innovation rendered these assumptions obsolete almost overnight, enabling tracked vehicles to carry forces from open water directly onto sand and through defenses that had been considered insurmountable. The speed and decisiveness of these operations underscore the decisive role of industrial capability and adaptive tactics in determining the fate of an empire.